Hello. I'd like to thank you all for being here. My name is Avital Ronell, and it's my pleasure to introduce Avital Ronell. I confess that introductions are not always easy, something that Avital herself has frequently acknowledged. Indeed, in a letter dated June 23, 1979, and included in Derrida's postcard, the late philosopher tells us that after a lecture, several people presented themselves to him. He recalls one. "With you, one can no longer present oneself," a young American woman says to me. She gives me to understand that she has read Moi, la psychanalyse, in which I let play in English, but so difficult to translate vocabulary of presentation, of presentations, of introductions, etc. As I was insisting on getting her name, insisting is too strong, she said metaphysics, and refused to add a single word. I found this little game rather clever, and I felt through the insignificant frivolity of the exchange that she had gone rather far. I was told afterward that she was a Germanist, end quote. There would be much to say about this exchange, starting with the fact that Avital here announces herself as the object of Derrida's desire, metaphysics. But that she is a Germanist is the least we can say here. Avital is University Professor in Humanities in the Departments of Germanic Languages and Literature and Comparative Literature at NYU. She is also the Jacques Derrida Professor of Media and Philosophy at the European Graduate School in Saas-Fee. Her work is known internationally for its daring engagement with several of the most urgent issues of our time: technology, war, drugs, AIDS, medical ethics, gender and race relations, state terrorism, personal and national identity, the relations between the humanities and the sciences, and the politics of representation, as well for its very performative and even poetic style. For more than 3 decades, Avital's writings have promoted the reconfiguration of literary and cultural studies, encouraging literary critics and philosophers to pursue questions about the nature of information and communication systems, the relations among literature, philosophy, and the technical media. This work has stood as an example for the most needed interdisciplinary work. Avital's many books include Dictations on Haunted Writing, which seeks to trace the various ways in which Goethe and his writings cast their shadows on the work of literature and psychoanalysis. Delineating the contours of what she calls the Goethe effect on Goethe's secretary, Johann Ackermann, and on Freud, she explores questions of personal identity, literary influence, transmission, and inheritance, but also translates these mostly literary questions into a model for thinking about how our psyche is formed. In the telephone book, Technology, Schizophrenia, Electric Speech, she returns to the questions of information transmission, psychoanalysis, and consciousness, but this time within a rich history of the impact of the telephone on modern thought. Noting the appearance of the telephone in the literary works of Strindberg, Kafka, Rilke, Joyce, and Duras, the philosophical works of Benjamin, Heidegger, and Derrida, and the psychoanalytic works of Freud and Laing, she traces the historical development of the telephone from Alexander Graham Bell's early experiments to the invention of answering machines and voicemail systems. Using the telephone as a synecdoche for technology in general, she produces a series of analyses that raise fundamental questions about the relations between selves and others, the destination of speech, and since the telephone always relates us to an absent other, the relation between technologies of communication and acts of mourning. In Crap Wars, Literature and Addiction Mania, Avital turns her attention to a philosophical and literary history of drugs and addiction. Evoking a long tradition of writing that has associated literature and drugs, from Plato to Homer to Coleridge to De Quincey to Baudelaire and beyond, literature often has been linked to inspiration, intoxication, and addiction. She formulates a context in which we might understand the addictions that define our modernity. Offering a history that asks whether drugs are the historical fulfillment of technology, or whether technology itself is to be understood as belonging to the domain of drugs, she demonstrates that far from being an aberration, addiction has been inspired and supported by a culture that is itself dependent on the creation of destructive desires. Avital's book, Finitude Score, collects several of her literary, philosophical, and political essays from the early 1980s to the mid-1990s. Like all her work, these essays range across several national literatures, several philosophical traditions, and several diverse figures of finitude in our modern world. War, guerrilla video, trauma TV, AIDS, music, divorce, sadism, and rumor. In her book, Stupidity, Avital offers an analysis of what she calls cognitive failure. Taking her point of departure from the political and social implications of stupidity diagnosed by Marx and Nietzsche, she provides a genealogy of the concept of stupidity within literary, philosophical, and political discourses. Beginning with Plato and moving through such figures as Hegel, Kant, Wordsworth, Dostoevsky, and Musil, she suggests how stupidity provokes a crisis in our understanding of politics, ethics, and psychoanalysis. Suggesting that one could not easily imagine circumstances in which an agency of state, of government, even a U.S. government, would declare war on stupidity in the manner it has engaged a large-scale war on drugs. She declares her own war on stupidity, interrogating how it manifests and disguises itself, and offering us an essential resource for understanding the dangerous character of our present administration. Avital's other books include The Test Drive, a Nietzschean genealogy of the drive of testing within Western culture, which focuses especially on the relations between philosophy and science, hypotheses and truth, experiments and reality, and which includes detailed analyses of the rhetoric of scientific experiments and testing practices. Covers materials from such scientists as Kepler, Boyle, Popper, and Einstein, suggesting that the logic of the test infiltrates the very core of the technological project. She demonstrates how the question of experimental testing, which touches everything from recent wars, urban planning, and the police, to medical and reproductive technologies, to the aporias in ethics, drug testing, and GRE scores, involves a reconceptualization of the legal and personal subject. In Loser Sons, Politics and Authority, she draws on current philosophy, literary history, and political events to confront, in her words, the grim fact that divested boys can become terrifying men, and to show how ideologies of all sorts perpetuate the theme that while childhood represents innocence, adulthood entails responsible cruelty, end quote. She addresses the problems of authority, paternal fantasy, and childhood as they've been explored and in some cases exemplified by Kafka, Kojève, Lyotard, George W. Bush, Osama bin Laden, and in a future second edition, we can perhaps hope for an additional chapter on our current president. In 2015, Avital received the insignia of Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters from the French government. Her talk today is entitled Immaturity. Please help me welcome Avital to the summer.
My respect and admiration for you, and you, and you. O einer, o keiner, o niemand, o du. Oh, someone, oh, no one, or no one, or you. O einer, o keiner, o niemand, o du. So this would be the roaming device of Paul Celan. Many of you will have recognized it from Atemwende, where he's looking for a call to attach, or maybe precisely not. I want to consider today, in our thinking of immaturity, which will be only briefly offered so that we can have a large-scale discussion on a day where the Supreme Court has disappointed us once again. So we may want to have certain inroads where we can give some reflection to what is happening and the certain invasive institutional, political, ethical crises we find ourselves in. I was thinking this morning about some of the work of Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe and the way, particularly in his work called Phrase, the way that he tries to fix the regulation to which mortals must submit of being abandoned, and what it means to be abandoned by figures and exigencies of ideals, of conceptual supplies and provisions that we've counted on, of certain, if obsolete, nonetheless somehow psychically implemented promises made by Enlightenment thinking, and so on and so forth. And what it means in also a Hölderlinian sense, because this was the great poet to which Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, the philosopher and poet himself, who wrote phrase in a clinic when he was feeling the greatest despair and hopelessness. He was also thinking about what it is to be abandoned. And he recognizes in a certain way that, that as he circles a pain that keeps us in place, he recognizes that there might be that place of being that that lets down in a nowhere, perhaps in the oblique neighborhood of Paul Celan's, the poet with whom I opened today, unwo, an unwhere, an unwo. Yet Lacoue-Labarthe holds back. He's not going there. He's not going to the unwhere. And this is one of the questions ever since technological atopos has been implemented, not only materially but psychically, and mapped certain ways in which we live and cease to live. Celan and Lacoue-Labarthe try to imagine how we live with this unwo, an unwhere, and a kind of undwelling that, if we had time and this were a seminar, I might urge us to think in terms of Heidegger's thought of dwelling and housing projects, and that which hosts us or shows us hospitality or refuses hospitality. So Lacoue-Labarthe doesn't go there to the unwo as such, though the catastrophe to which Celan holds is never far from Lacou's reflections and historical insistence. One of his major concerns, despite all the barriers stacked up against fate and the way he's blocked out the destinal call, he's unfriended the gods, and he's taken up with abandonment. One of his concerns, given this pileup of emptying of all of the, let's say, metaphysical strongholds to which we still attach despite all the work and deconstructive encouragement we might have felt, one of his concerns is that poetry has moved out of historical precincts and trivialized itself, become immature. In some background negotiation, poetry cut a deal with its detractors and has sold itself short, bailing on the weight of responsibility that historically toned writing imposes. Hölderlin and the Schlegels understood the indelible urgency of poetry's mission statements, the historical vigilance of poesis from which Benjamin drew essential materials and of which Heidegger took advantage. By the way, I come with footnotes. I want to be intelligible. You can hit the pause button and rewind and ask me to reveal to you my subtitles or supertitles, whatever you need in order to read some of this with me. Or we can go for a certain amount of Nachträglichkeit or postponement and wait till the discussion to clarify some points here. So poetry So when I say Heidegger took advantage of some of Hölderlin's assertions about the mission of poetry, Heidegger scandalously appropriated what Hölderlin was urging or precisely resisting and turned it into a type of call that la coulabate must decline. So poetry, in the meantime, has backed down from the loose appointment of a destiny without destiny. So la coulabate, in his thinking, shows how destiny no longer has a destiny, which, by the way, is good news. All those who think there's a destiny to follow, or a national entity to make great again and meet its destiny, for example, are moving toward a kind of a catastrophic promissory note that la coulabate is happier to find shredded, and shredded by none other than Hölderlin, whom Heidegger kidnaps to have him say something different. So there's a kind of new appointment of a destiny without destiny, leaving in its wake an historical need for poetic sobriety, the invention of new world formations and address. So we need to, without destiny, without destination, we need to invent new addresses, new world formations, even question the significance and possibility of world. And as shattered as someone like, even though there's no one like Hannah Arendt, might be by the way world has devolved and busted up and broken promises, she never puts in question the world or mundus or globality. And she does not put away either the figure of man with which she still runs. She has her reasons and unreasons to do so. But la coulabate, and this is much too quickly contrasted and contracted, nonetheless it probably ought to be said, he's trying to not pick up the pieces, but work with the pieces and shattering without trying to recuperate anything like world or man or other conceptual strongholds to which we still pay many taxes, I'll say. Now, poetry, he claims, has abandoned its post of vigilance and positing. It's abandoned its place of mature reflection, its unique capacity to respond and cast new rifts in language. In a sense, poetry has, not in a sense, altogether and strongly, poetry has given up on itself and on us. And the kind of degradation of language that we're all now moving through and contaminated by is only one effect of that kind of relinquishment that he finds that poetry has allowed for. So you see that at one point, at one and the same time, he kind of abominates Heidegger's kidnapping of the poetic word to make it say destiny and destinal things and posit what Heidegger calls historial kinds of meaning, which is to say instituting new forms and thoughts. I'm saying this much too quickly. But at the same time, la coulabate seems to retain a certain rectitude that poetry models in its way, and our need for the poetic word to continue to kind of eviscerate itself because it might have seen too much, as Hölderlin says of Oedipus. So that is a very quick run through of a frame I'd like to establish and retain with you of what we might call upon poetry to not return to, but avow in a certain way that it's abandoned us. At the same time, abandonment is our destiny. It's not something that we should think can be overcome or sidelined or forgotten. Abandonment is our destiny. Now, when I proposed the topic of immaturity to Hent, I could not have known that we would find ourselves stung by a country where the powered up and dangerously immature were caging the undefended, those minoritized minors and minorities, those little ones being trafficked right now and violated according to the prompts of a nihilistic disclosure we could not have anticipated just a few years ago. Though we should have anticipated, because there's something as extreme as what is happening now that was already set in place, kind of Gestell, to speak with Heidegger. I don't speak with him often, but to speak with Heidegger right now, that was in place. Lacan reminds us that Freud never handled anger in psychoanalysis. And there are many reasons for this and unreasons. Let us try to think with our outrage and bring language to those in terrible grief and suffering. What this country needs are some emergency supplies of language now, despite what you might think. But you might be surprised to hear that I've heard from so many since the disaster in Puerto Rico and elsewhere, and from Latin America certainly, that they need language from us. They need us to think this and not to relinquish our place and tasks of vigilance, if that's possible. That seems perhaps contraindicated, but not at all, as I'll try to show momentarily. So too many remain silent, too many among us, or stalled, understandably, by obsolesced paradigms that are reemerging and motored by disavowal and mendacity. So look, I don't have all the answers, as you've already seen and heard. I see my task and struggle as protecting the question. That would be my job description, to protect the question, preserving a wildlife sanctuary for thought that is not dissociable from action, activism, act, and the severity of accountability. Now, Lacan, the philosopher with whom I opened, has said that the 20th century and going into the 21st century is defined by three, in terms of its philosophical pulses, by three essential modalities and moods. One is struggle, one is task, and the third would be mission. He attaches these to proper names, and if we could play a game, I would ask you to let me hear the name. When you hear struggle, that would be Marx. Good. You get a refrigerator. Very good. So struggle is one way in which thought and our relation to world or its shattering has been appropriated exemplarily by Marx. Task, do I hear? Right, excellent. And mission, would be Heidegger. So these are three fundamental modalities of our relation to thought. Not that Lacan is so ignorant or immature as to keep them radically separated, but he wants us first to heed the calls that were made from the sight and urgent promptings of these proper names, Marx, Benjamin, and the other one, Heidegger. Okay, so I'd like us to bear that in mind, that these would be the tensional qualities and something that we might want to consider, especially in terms of the impossible hurdles that we face these days on all levels of being, and the cultural pushback and insult that goes to the work that you all do. I want to personally, not that I'm a person or I have a place of personally speaking, nonetheless, I do want to offer you my gratitude and hope for the kind of work you're doing despite the odds and against all odds. So today I wanted, in fact, and planned to trace an arc from Kant's thought on immaturity through Lyotard and psychoanalysis, including, pertinently, I thought, Freud's comments on the pleasure one takes in excrementalized language usage, such as that of presidential diction. So Freud's reading of the jouissance of smut, as he says in German, in conjunction with some thoughts on Twitterature, the immaturity of abbreviated forms of language that Heidegger saw as an effect of technology, a kind of immaturation of being, was something that I wanted to track with you. And I wanted to consider Pierre Alféry's work on Twitterature. My first title for today was Bigly Mistweeted, about the misfirings of tweets and what kind of mistweetments we're subjected to. And then I thought that was pretty immature. No way I'm showing up at Cornell speaking like some cartoon birdie. So nonetheless, I do feel mistweeted. Kant wonders, have you ever really met a mature person? Think about it. Have you ever really met a mature person? According to Nietzsche's tabulations, Goethe was one such person for all sorts of reasons. But for his part, Kant demonstrates how we are tethered to our immaturity. So immaturity isn't just something you can condemn or dispose of or somehow intellectually shut down. If it's to be considered something weighty enough to warrant our consideration and reflections, it's because we're in a relation of desire to our own immaturity. Of course, one can think of American youth culture. One can think about the divinization of immaturity on all sorts of scales and registers. So for Kant, it's very important that we understand that we're tethered to, we're chained to, and addicted to our immaturity and to external types of restraints and authority. So this would be something to consider with some rigor, rather than thinking that it's something that can be done away with. Kant exhorts us to give thought to what it is that keeps us immature and what is the desire for immaturity that's often in its disavowal projected on the other, very often the minor, the minorities, and other persecuted or persecutable beings. So we, according to Kant, we want to remain in immature headquarters. That is our human bent, and that is what we need to try to understand. Sometimes you are called out of your immature recessions, shaken to the core, made to take a call that you cannot feel but must accept, or drop, according to the ethical exigency pressing on you. It is not easy to decline a call. This is one of the things that I tried to work on for many years, how to disturb or disrupt a call. And your being is being called. You are constantly being called, if not on-called, and you are being called. What would it mean to somehow refuse that call? But as a Nietzsche baby, I'm trained on the transvaluating machine, so there are some calls, and this is what Derrida will teach us, is the madness of undecidability. There are certain calls that must not be refused. But this hesitation about which call to refuse or decline and which to accept is something that I actually inhabit in a tragic way, if I can speak about myself. So I realized as I was preparing today's talk on immaturity, I've had a lot of babies around me. I'm thinking of Cavell in Bringing Up Baby. I'm thinking of Hamacher in his article or essay, Das Beben, which resonates baby. It's Das Beben, which means quaking, the earth shake, we could say, in Chile, which Hamacher addresses. It's immature encroachment. I'm thinking of Dufour-Montel's consideration of childhood trauma. I thought as well of immaturity, of the immaturity in Seneca and Derrida, of every decline and death, the way they are ever too soon. So Derrida writes, reading Seneca, that every decline, every demise, and every death is premature or immature. And these are events of time's complicated refusal to mature. Give me another round. I'm sorry. O einer, o keiner, o niemand, o du. There is something that has obsessed me, a kind of recurrent motif, a plaintive cry put out in my prequel work, and that seems to be calling for attention right now, again. Embedded in the book on Loser Sons, as provisional site of ending it all, source and motor of devastation, one will find a sustained reflection on late puberty and the phantasm of maturity. By the way, Lyotard and Malraux claim there's no such thing as adulthood. Maturity is a pure fantasy. Or it could be, in Kantian terms, a regulatory ideal, something we are turned toward. Don't expect it to ripen or happen, but nonetheless, we're compelled by this ideal. So there might be, as I said earlier, some human states of exception to the question of whether we'd ever seen a mature being. But they too show the tendency to lapse into immaturity. Goethe, one of the historically maturest beings, according to the tabulations turned in by Nietzsche, was someone, according to Nietzsche, and I'm translating loosely here, who was able to transcend first chakra nationalisms, regressive familialisms, and all manner of tribal bonding needs. He, Goethe, credited his growth to what he called wiederholte Pubertät, so recurring puberty. The oversized writer counted on the returns of puberty to move on with creative and libidinal abundance, inviting the double edge of abandon and sovereign trespass. He abandoned himself to the returns of adolescent exuberance. At the same time, he was the poet who pressed claims about the correlative intensities of joy and suffering, and puberty consigns the upsurging child to pits of pain, smoothed over only by the tranquilizing boons of so-called adulthood. And here I urge us to keep in mind how adolescents famously feel very quickly that you've ruined their lives or that they're beyond joyful. And this is something that Goethe was able to retain in his poetic tween age. Speaking of the East-Westerly divan, I have seen spasms of immaturity strike even the wisest gurus and sensible teachers who suddenly go infantile. I'm sure you've never seen this among your teachers, but they suddenly go infantile, they giggle, they play, they shriek with laughter. It is not clear where to situate laughter on the developmental scale or when evaluating psychic and somatic outburst, how to account for the spiritual or purifying capacities of laughter and its openness to gender reassignment. In other words, do real men laugh? Or even the way it functions as a gift in Freud and in terms of disrupting vital registers of significance, how laughter has left an explosive hole in Bataille and Nancy. Film vocabularies run down the question of laughter's extra-human stretch, the demonic, the confessional prompt. So if we had time, I would ask each of you to laugh according to a certain moment in a film and to see how that breaks significance or brings in a certain type of significance and what it does to our thinking of Sinn and Bedeutung, so meaning and significance, and where laughter belongs, and if it can be held in by philosophy. Also, I would ask you to think of which gods were proved capable of laughing. I don't think you've seen Jesus Christ of Nazareth laugh very much. Puberty, perhaps not philosophically mature enough to have become a fully developed concept, sets up a breach, flagging a destructive passage on the road to majority. The minor hits a snag that may never entirely resolve, but is bound to return and deliver an unexpected knockout punch. Sparing only a few, puberty comes around the bend for the second and umpteenth time to offer faux replenishment or the bumbled bad news of your finitude, foretelling an imminent crash. Driven perhaps on the ontic level by metonymies of the newly flaunted sports car, the unaccountable affair, a new store of aggression and ensnaring spree of Selbstbehauptung, or self-affirmation. Again, Heidegger's essay on the university. Self-affirmation. The body bump of untimely self-assertion. The return of puberty undermines the flattering growth chart that humanity assigns to itself. As shock and disruption introduced to the concept of human developmentality, puberty is linked via Lyotard's political essays to Kant's remarkable statements about immaturity. And this is something that we've already heard about from me today, that Kant sets out from the insight that one wants to remain immature, tethered to authority, kept on a short leash in an existential and political comfort zone that stalls growth and seasoned decision. In the chapter Was war Aufklärung, so what was enlightenment, the turn of the screwed, I interrogate such a moment of faltering self-assumption as the passage through puberty. I return to this passage through puberty in Loser Sons in order to seize on an issue that has not yet received sufficient airplay or airplay. This is a Shakespearean pun of the air, what we inherit, and air, and can help us move forward if that is conceivable with the Hamlet dilemma, looping a hysterical knot that to this day tightens the noose around what we continue to incorporate and attach to, often unconsciously, as the political body. As weighty as Hamlet has been in terms of inheritance and gateway to the staple of infrastructuring themes of modernity, the play's remarkable resilience is also due to the flaws it exposes, the way it flatlines and plays dumb, trying to prompt a traumatic truth to speak. A dumb show haunts the dramaturgy as it explores the limits of saying and showing, wondering aloud if it is capable of instigating confession and aligning with justice. One is repressed, throttled, and voiceless, dependent on a ghost's directives and plaintive insistence for motive and intelligibility. Hamlet, who no doubt has slimmed down or was considerably photoshopped for the portrait we may carry of him, wallet or poster size, started out, I don't know what your images, and if we had time, and maybe we do, I'd find out, of Hamlet are, what your introject, your Hamletian introject looks like. But he started out as a pudgy adolescent. Bulked with body excess, he faces off with the bodiless inflation of paternal overdrive. How does Hamlet carry the weight of his heritage? When Lyotard moves on troubled adolescent awakening, he knowingly dwells at the limits of philosophical statement and determination, rehearsing that which may well lie beyond the scope of philosophical reach and investigation. Maybe the overweight waddle of Prince Hamlet is not a matter for speculation or the corporeal zoom, part of sizing his portion of indecisive agony. Or maybe he needed the carriage of young portliness, a way of taking up space in the kingdom that at once counted him in and counted him out, while all the while counting on him. What about the body of the prince? How does it reflect the political body, bloated with gluttony, morally emaciated according to the transcripts that the prince handles, in contrast to the vanished body of the king? This line of questioning, its imprudent check on a figure cut by the prince, seems no doubt out of bounds for philosophical inquiry as we know it. Philosophy nowadays won't be starved out, however, and goes after the most minute triggers of obsession. Adolescence, the cusp of immaturity, fits only with difficulty into its bodies, protesting all manner of unjust burdening. And philosophy itself has to be prodded and poked if it is to start reasoning with the unreasonable. This is where Hamlet pushes Horatio on the point of what can happen in excess of philosophical dream schemes. Philosophy can dream. I return to this arena in order to lift a latent strand of thought that may provide us with access to the jouissance of the complainer, who may be held back by the line of Kantian immaturity. Hamlet is staggered by a mode of address that can be integrated only minimally, if at all. Lyotard's figures for adolescents have not reached the level of maturity that could reasonably field a call of the magnitude that befalls them. So this is what Lyotard understands as the adolescent alteration Freud calls adolescence or puberty an alteration. Something shifts that can't be properly accounted for. And something of a magnitude befalls the child that switches her over into adolescent agony. These children who are suddenly switched into adolescent readiness are traumatically called up by a force or voice or prod that cannot properly be deciphered, yet produces that strong alteration, Freud's designation for the episode of puberty. So Freud wants to contain puberty and call it an episode. And this alteration, puberty, occurs when the turnover from childhood to majority is marked. Off target, yet on the way to them, the call fatefully diverts them, and something drastic happens, an uncontrollable spill of being that jostles the kids, relating them to the unrelatable. So suddenly, these kids are made to have a rapport or a relation to what they can't relate to or can't be related to, the unrelatable. The jolt that they receive when picking up the untranslatable call, or the call that only ever relays its own untranslatability, evokes the shock of puberty. The rebellious blur, says Lyotard, bleeding out of the dilemma of impaired comprehension. So the shock of puberty, and even when the boy's voice starts squeaking and changing specially even momentarily, is something that emerges from this impaired, a dilemma of impaired comprehension. One can't get a hermeneutic fit around what's happening. What is happening is precisely, say, the phrase or part of the phrasal regime that marks this moment. What is happening to me? It's a double phrase. What is happening and what is happening to me? I did not want to miss out on focusing a piece of Hamlet's Commando reactivity, the specific way he remains enraged, yet stalled, rebellious, yet unable to execute a plan or hit an assigned target, girlfriend bound, yet mother fixated, cute, but yet to lose the baby fat, as part of the unaccountable upheaval, the social out-of-jointedness pertaining to a condition at once common, because everyone goes through this self-estrangement, more or less, and alien. What kind of freakish monstrosity just got released on the community of family, friendship, and political observers? According to Lyotard, the shock of puberty, the rattling call, shapes our political narratives, even as it apparently recedes to raise havoc on more unconscious channels of social behavior. If I'm getting this right, the brand of hysteria ascribable to puberty cuts into the spheres of political performance and agonized concern for justice in a number of ways. My own assessment, reading psychoanalysis, including K.R. Eisler, Lyotard, and the victims of recurring puberty, is that the excited teen running high on self-inflationary fuel and disrupted by an untranslatable address sparks the scene of action. Puberty's claims announce themselves each time uniquely in full revolt of what is. The runaway teen spirit going nowhere fast, riveted by a sudden arousal, an awakening, enters a stretch of being that remains enigmatic and active, infiltrating all manner of social practice. Occupied to a considerable degree by adolescent tropes of giddiness, overabundance, sarcasm, and ruin, the despondencies and grammars of excitability, the stoppers and starters of social responsiveness still need to be accounted for, even if we lack a grid to tabulate the saturation of the political according to adolescent excitability. In terms of the disturbing jolts visited upon those hapless receptors, Hamlet proves to be terror-riven as he tries to field a deracinating call that spurs him to stand up in submissive readiness. I think you know that Hamlet repeats that the readiness is all. On one level, standout teens share the predicament of receiving an instruction, an intrusive charge and convocation. They are commanded to respond to a call. Ready or not, adolescents are made to assume that a call is meant for them. Hamlet understands, as I just said, that readiness is all. But was he ready for what was coming at him? The call rips through them before they are prepared to become who they are, marking an experience of shattering decision that paradoxically makes them who they are, skipping the beat and reassuring time of becoming. So there's no happy moment here or moments of becoming. There's a sudden crush of identity that they must seize upon. They are riveted and invaded by a ghostly call under whose authority they are bound to freeze up. The numbed reluctance to assume responsibility for what continues to arrive unannounced, the coercive pull to take the call, sustains the affective haze of political torpor and childish recoil. Still, there are calls, as I've been trying to track elsewhere, that should not be taken and are really not meant for those overactive teenagers who presume to be born to set things right. This is all very difficult to sort out, no doubt, yet a plan at least has been outlined, emerging from these primal and pulsating jolts that exhort us to adjust a practice to the endangered stance of rigorous hesitation. So rigorous hesitation is a concept developed by La Coulabarde in the thought of a cautious ethicity. The child, hesitant and ever incredulous on the one hand, prematurely triggered, tight and ready to spring to action on the other, must lean into the emptiness of the voiding call, another name for puberty's shakedown. According to Lyotard, Kant paved the way of a steep slope on the downside of nothingness, the id side to which I am singularly host and hostage. Drawing puberty onto the political platform of deed and reflection, Lyotard attempts to maintain something of a philosophical claim. To speak in an intelligible fashion, he writes, on the subject of the id side of the articulable, that is to say, of the nihil, is what we need to understand. I don't know how you're getting this. I'm like hysterically anxious. Talk about untranslatable calls. Lyotard scrolls down to the Kantian id side of things, even though Kant has remained too strongly attached, he observes, to subjectivist thought, that is, to a philosophy of consciousness. The brand of hysteria ascribable to puberty cuts into the political performance in considerable ways, requiring us to revisit time and again some circumscribed zones of unmarked intensity. It would be wrong-headed, I think, to assume that one could simply skip over the motif and developmental historical stopover of puberty when modern politics have depended so emphatically on teenaged mythologies and fast-tracking disasters? Well, that would set up my complaint of the human, urging a relentless probe of extra and infra-human regression, where adulthood is consistently subject to annulment. How was political utterance and behaviors returned to adolescent forms of bickering and human, all too human rhetorical failures? Perhaps the timeout still observed by Hamlet requires a renewed reflection on political action in the sense of Arendt, and the complaint of puberty in the sense of compromised sense. Hamlet, excessive and reputedly ineffective, modeling the shocked incomprehension of a social body, has only himself to complain to. Hence the famous soliloquy, a filter of the unanswered call of anguish. Trump has Twitter to complain to, and an arsenal ready to go off. Thank you.
We have a lot of time for discussion. Yes.
Avital, thank you for giving us this wonderful language and thought, and getting to thought. As you were talking about puberty, I was thinking again about those scenes in the early Freud and the seduction period, and the way puberty appears there. That's always seen more than what he, or other than what he designates it as. So, the first scene of the trauma being the molestation, let's say, and it's not traumatic. And the second scene being after puberty, and it's not a molestation, but it is traumatic. So there's this two-scene structure that Lacan's got. But puberty there is designated as when you come into sexuality, and therefore what you didn't recognize as sexual early on now is both recognized and denied. But puberty, so it structures the two scenes, it structures not triglyceride there. And I was wondering, I've always sort of wondered about the status of puberty there, but I haven't really done more than wonder. And I'm wondering if you now could articulate how you think about that, reread it, since it is there. You talk about trauma being entangled with puberty, and there it is at the beginning of Freud. But it's clearly designated as if it were an impure. I'm not quite sure what it's meant to be, what determines when puberty comes and how it's linked to the trauma that early Freud. So could you just sort of say what you think about that, or how you read
Thank you so much, Kathy Caruth, who in appreciating my language must have recognized her own language. And I'm tracking, not that I want to blame you for what was said, but I was working along in the larger version of this, working with your thinking on trauma and scenes of incomprehension, a certain unbearable relation to the non-experience of experience that awaits Nachträglichkeit or postponement to have become what couldn't have been as such experienced in the shock of a marking. So a lot of dossiers could be opened that would be considered triggerable here, maybe not here, but certainly at NYU, where I come from. The there's something that I would open up in terms of a rendezvous, an improbable rendezvous, though not impossible. And even though the impossible doesn't intimidate us, in fact, that's what calls to us. As Derrida would say, or did say, that if it's possible, okay, that's a translation from. I'll defer to someone else. I'll yield to someone else if it's possible. If it's impossible, bring it to me and put it on my desk. So a certain impossible occurs and may be contained, I say provisionally, because we would have to read the text with extreme rigor and anxiety to get it right, if there's such a possible hermeneutic. Well, if it's hermeneutic, you can get it right. But if you follow your hermeneutic compulsion, you have to go into the zones where you get it wrong, necessarily. So in Levinas and Derrida, there would be a possible moment, and you can't just mash these up together. Obviously, it would take me months to allow myself to put these names and texts in correspondence as though it were doable. So these are long-distance calls. Nonetheless, you would want to maybe consider that there's an undecidable character of something that Heidegger, I would say, calls the Stoß. So the push, the prod, the goading that is essential for something to happen. A Stoß is something that it could be a poke, as you get in Facebook, poke someone. Now, is that nice to poke someone? Is it? So the undecidability would be located in whether something is a violation or a caress. In nearly all the great love stories, and I don't like to generalize, so delete that remark. Nonetheless, in order to pretend we're moving forward, I'll do it again. In all the great love stories, there's a kind of, and you start out with Tancred and so on, there's a kind of wounding. And in Tristan and Isolde, there's a wounding that awakens, that is the wounding of a kind of traumatic envoi or message or destining or destinaring of love. A wounding that, by its very nature, would have to be a violation, but is also the opening caress of a kind of shock into a mode of being that was unpredicted, unprogrammable, certainly part of a risk-taking when you open to the other. So there's something like a Heideggerian Stoß that I would like to consider and run with, and maybe in a technological testing way, test to failure. Paul de Man taught us how to live with and go after exemplary error, which is not the same as a mere mistake, he says. So whenever I make a mere mistake, I'm going to call it an exemplary error, but that's an off-ramp. So I'd like to run something and test it to failure, to test the possibility that there's an undecidable character to the Stoß, the prod, the push, and even the smack or smackdown. To what degree is, even when you think your lights are being punched out, is that also an awakening? Is that what the great epic love stories, whether they're failures or not, and to be great epic, they must be, actually articulate and disarticulate that to be struck by lightning or the bolt of an opening to alterity means that you've been necessarily violated, you've been necessarily seized and called, you've been subjected to a dispossession that is extreme and that is a fundamental shakedown of your being. Don't be too quick to know what that means or if that means. And I would hesitate to ascribe meaning to it immediately. Nonetheless, I think when Freud hits the pause button, it's not only to gasp, maybe, with, oh, what just happened? Is this happening, first of all? Is it an occurrence or is it an inoccurrence? And Kathy Caruth shows us how all of history depends on our non-knowledge. Sorry for the distortion and mendacity here. Non-knowledge is what all of our sense of history and the meaning that we infuse history and historical narrative with depends on a traumatic breakthrough or breakdown that can't simply be recuperated through meaning or through knowing what the hell just happened. Like, do you know what's happening now? Of course we do, but do we, in certain ways and in a certain context that Freud delimits for us, there's the invasive, intrusive, traumatically gripping call that may seem to dispossess you of any history you might have had or will have had, but also marks you in a certain way that becomes the root of an infrastructure. All trauma is structuring. So it would be foolish for those of us who are scholars of atrocity, traumatic despair, national distress, racist outrage. It would be foolish to think that trauma, even on the most minute scale or in occurrence, is something that can be avoided or escaped. The question, maybe, if it's a question, is how does it structure or resignify or bring up significance? So I don't know. Of course, these hesitations on the part of Freud, and that's why I brought up Lacoue-Labarthe's thought of a rigorous hesitation. It might not be that he's a wuss or he's blind or delusional or, God forbid, misogynist only and merely, but that sometimes a pause has to be observed, not in order to understand what happened, but to maybe get a sense of what didn't happen, what can't happen, what we can't be certain happens, and also a kind of Nietzschean pump, to let a Nietzschean pump start moving in and create a certain fiction as well. There's always a fictioning involved. That doesn't mean that one wasn't molested or devastated or rearranged on a molecular level, never to recover, and so on and so forth. No one is stupid enough to deny that. The minute you're hatched, you're smacked into existence on your tush, right? So there is no non-trauma zone.
So thank you. I don't want to ask.
Go ahead.
But I just want to say, I think you've just helped me understand what Lafranche meant when he said that when Freud gave up the seduction theory, why reducing it to just
Thank you. But one of the stories of Freud and Lyotard shared by them is the story of Emma, where the shopkeeper, right, lasciviously looks at her and checks her out. And this is a child who suddenly receives the call of a kind of tagging, and this could be a racialist tag too, that someone realizes you're Asian, you're this, you're that, whatever coding can be considered to be prevalent for a moment and provisionally useful for someone. And that being called out or called by a certain imposed identity is shocking. It's shocking to learn, believe me, it's shocking to learn you're Jewish. It's shocking to learn you're a girl. These are shocking, invasive, and intrusive tags that Emma experiences or can't experience, but that transform her nonetheless. It's a violent shakedown and imposition of something like an identity.
So I want to first of all, thank you so much. This is such rich material. My question has to do with the distinction between immaturity and youth. And I was wondering, so for example, it seems to me that there are certain forms of immaturity that we are more tolerant of than others. I'm thinking, for example, in a given family system, some of the most damaging relationships are those in which a child is not allowed to be immature and is instead asked to be the mature one, and that the parent is allowed to be immature. Or in the situation of a kingdom, a king is allowed to be immature and subjects aren't, or something like this. So I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about, again, that imbalance, what kinds of tolerance, what kinds of immaturities we are tolerant of or intolerant of, and also the question of age.
What question of age? I'm kidding. I don't have issues. That's a good stoß, a good prod, which is who has the right to be immature and to rage and to be undisciplined. And isn't that paradoxically almost a sovereign right, and what Lacan has called the idiot king, which has something to do with blindness, or if we went to the Purloined Letter, we could, with Poe and Lacan and Derrida, and also Barbara Johnson and others, Shoshana Feldman, have worked through and with, you'll see how out of it and sidelined the sovereign figure, the king, is. So very often the most, let's say, sovereign also can be the most unaccountable and doesn't have to account for anything in terms of the kind of speech act that sovereignty always enacts and embodies and implies. So there's so much to be said about immaturity, certainly in German idealism and also in Goethe and also the prizing of youth at the same time as immaturity is disavowed. So this would be something that I would want, whose itinerary I would want to complicate, because certainly America is a youth invested in something called youth culture, but it disavows its painful immaturity at this point. I'm not sure about what to say in terms of investments and reinvestments immaturity, there's certainly in German literature and philosophy the certain thought that all of the political philosophers that I've been engaged with are very attuned to, such as the thought of Bildung, which is formation, and how certainly in the Bildungsroman called Wilhelm Meister by Willy Goethe, immaturity is something that must suffer and succumb to a symbolic death. So a very violent and a very real disappointment in the world, a very real diminishment. There's no pretty way to get out of immaturity unless one is disciplined like a bonsai almost. In other words, you can stay small, but it's such a kind of willful disciplining of a being, whether it be a plant life or a human life, that Goethe was trying to regulate in certain ways. So it's not that we really know entirely, though there are fabulous and necessary discourses and thoughts on immaturity. Don't forget that Hegel ruled out immaturity for philosophy. He said philosophy is for adults. And this is one of the things that drew me to this topos, if it is one. So where and when and how do the children start crawling into philosophical headquarters and set off alarms? And where do you see them? One place you see them is with the idiot children that were invented in the 18th century, because the empiricists needed to recruit something or someone to prove quite a lot about our theories of language and understanding. So the idiot child, or the unteachable child, is one who stands or falls for us as a state that is prior to language acquisition or any kind of understanding. So that kind of child became prized by the empiricists and was recruited to good philosophical usage in order to hold together a sense of our origins. So this is always a complicated and ambivalent relation to our origins. One of the big narcissistic blowouts occurred when Darwin said our ancestor was a gorilla. We still haven't gotten over that as a species, and it probably in many ways accounts, I know this sounds so weird, but it accounts for a lot of animal cruelty in a parasital way. If that's our father, we have to go after it. I said that as an off-ramp irresponsibly, but I want to have made a point about what counts as immature is also our origin in a certain way. So there's a double and disavowed and ambivalent relation to that, and it's seen as that which must be overcome somehow. Also in narratives of Christianity superseding Judaism in some corners of the world. Yes.
So Avital, thank you, it was great. And I think I always ask you the same question in some way, and it always feels like a stupid question, but I'll try again.
I'm always
which is,
lucky.
no, I just thought the language was wonderful, and I want to talk about the language because in that language there's also humor. And
Very funny. Yes.
yeah, but there's humor, and it does something to the presentation. Because the presentation is as desperate as the traumatic experience entails. And it's not far from reality, a certain reality which you keep referencing in the beginning and the end of your talk to have us think collectively about Trump. And here's my issue. I always have trouble with psychoanalytic categories to move from the experience of the individual to the collective. And in the 19th century, someone like Marx, had a very, rather, for us, naive understanding of ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. So that's the way he handled that mediation. And we're not, we wouldn't go there, even in our most Marxist moments, it seems to me, because you end up saying, the Greeks had immature art because they were in an immature era of society, etc. So this is kind of like what I'm wondering, with what's happening with your presentation, which toggles between the individual psychoanalytic and the political collective. And I'm wondering, would you accept that my perception at this moment, that just as with jokes and their relation to the unconscious, the laughter that is shared is not just the universalization of an individual situation, but a social mediation and a collective release. So I guess I'm asking, if I were to describe your way of negotiating this and claim that language, that what I'm calling humor in your language is a necessary part of the theory, would I be totally off?
No. However, thank you. Thank you for considering what one is to make of this presentation. When I brought in that redneck Heidegger, it was, and then I also think I said that Lyotard is disappointed that Kant still, that Kant shrinks from his and recoils from his insight and still sticks with subjectivist and thought and tropes of consciousness. That was in order to lift the suspicion that I was working with individuals or anything psychologistic or anything as comforting as a collective. Nonetheless, I was working very hard and maybe earnestly in considering and allegorizing the predicament of what it is to impart something and to part with certain comforts or holds that might work or not. In other words, stripped down of all sorts of metaphysical anchors. How do you move through what we've inherited and learned, what's been decimated, without regressing? I don't feel one has the right to regress to even the promise of a release. I'm not releasing anyone. I'm not released from responsibility. I'm not released to my own recognizance even. So that it might be the case that irony, which keeps on parabasically insisting on disjunction, difference, distance, non-coincidence of what is being said, and maybe the tonality, that marking and remarking these disjunctions are what I feel responsible to do. I don't think in a certain way one has the right to dress in pathos, even though that might be my regressive pose, my first, sun salutation in the morning is to pathos and distress and pain and so on. But responsibly, I don't feel the right to understand that I can present that, except to mark a certain exposition to tropes and figures to which we are subjected. I don't know if that's clear. It would be much easier and more fun to offer subjectivist memoir, self-reappropriating stories and narratives, but the cut of humor or irony that you're detecting is also to cut me out of the picture even as I impose myself. So I have lots of fake IDs and multiple personalities that I put up there in order to hitch a ride with thought, to ventriloquate in a, I hope, responsible or utterly irreverent way, but nonetheless calling to our teachers without the pose of subjective mastery. If I could just joke around or something, that would suggest some sort of mastery, which I'm deprived of. And I don't know if that in any way begins to stammer toward, you know what happened to me is when you said you don't like, if that's what I heard, I converted it, psychoanalysis. Did you say that, or did you actually say that to me? Yeah. Okay, no, or the individual or something. It messed me up. It troubles you. Oh, that's worse than you don't like it. That's the Nietzschean, you know, I have a problem with something you said, or it troubles you. Then I get troubled. But I think that to the extent that psychoanalysis and Lyotard and Derrida and others, and even Heidegger, go in and out of anthropological moments and subjectivist illusions or holding pens for a second. I dart in and out of those spaces, but I don't think that I would re-signify or regress into an individual. I'm just a transmitter. I feel very technologically inscribed or exscribed, and I wouldn't be able to reconstitute as an individual, nor would I be able to recognize something as a collective. That's because I'm straitjacketed by the trainings that I've been, and the paces that I've been put through. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm not one to make sense of things that have made too much sense and are destroying the worlds that are already destroying.
Avital, I want to tell you a scene that listening to you has illuminated for me in a way that I find marvelous. And it's a scene in the Mozart opera about the play by Beaumarchais, about which it was said that already the revolution was happening when this play was performed by Beaumarchais, The Marriage of Figaro. And because what's so striking to me as a reading of this opera that you open up to me, and the book that you open up to me, is the fact that there's this adolescent figure in it, Cherubino.
That's right.
And he's sort of uncontrollable. He moves around, he keeps turning up unexpectedly. And there's one particular scene that means a lot to me in almost every production of this play or this opera, and it's one in which he's poked. Cherubino is, because he's overheard the Count philandering, the Count wants to get rid of him. And so the Count sends him off, is going to send him off to be in the army, in the Count's regiment. And it's a cruel thing to do. And Figaro looks as though he is sort of roughing up Cherubino, and he touzles him, and he sort of pushes him around. And first the Count is watching this and smiling, because it seems as though Figaro's doing the same thing. He's the older person who is forcing the young one to shape up. But then it turns, and in the final moment of this scene, you see Figaro turning Cherubino towards the Count, and all of a sudden he's trying to get Cherubino to relate to the idea of being in the military, which is awful to him. So it's as though he's easing him into that new role. But all of a sudden, the music goes into a kind of a march, and you've got Figaro, who's the bourgeois revolution, facing the aristocrat, the Count, with this boy, and he's getting him to salute, ironically, to the Count. And all of a sudden, the Count is furious, and he stomps out, and that's the end of the scene. And what that book has always been readable to me as is, in modern productions, the fast-forwarding from the moment of pre-French Revolution, like 1789, 88, to, the Beaumarchais play was before that, to the Napoleonic armies. All of a sudden, the page has turned from, and Cherubino is not a page anymore. He is a member of that army that is going to be taking over Europe and imposing republican values on previously absolutist monarchies. And it's as though what gets into the productions of the opera at a particular point in the readings of the French Revolution is a use of the figure of the adolescent to represent something that's finally ambiguous. It's the appropriation of the adolescent to tell a story about history, but it's also an enabling moment in which the aggression is directed back at the aggressor, the one who's in power at that point. Does that make sense in terms of what you're saying about a pope and an adolescent?
It's very, very revealing. I was darting here and there and thinking about Cherubino becoming historical. First, he's on the id side of, he's all over Zerlina, he can't keep his little hands off anyone, and he falls in love every 2 minutes, and then suddenly is going to be, and always played by a woman, I think, and so there's that bit of a gender drifting and so on. It made me think of how adolescents have been put to military or military even use in also, I was thinking of Larry Rickles' assertion that the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, is a conscription of adolescent superegoical, in that case, force that turned on the parents and on the whole society, and how adolescents historically, in more modern episodes, become the ones that are set to oversee with their funneled libidos and libidinal energies, and to threaten and intimidate the adults. Like, what do you do with the adolescent, the politicized or politicizable and sizable superegoical inflation of adolescent self-righteousness? Like, who in their right mind thinks that they were they were born to set things right? And that can be alt-right, very much to the right, or also we depend on that energy in a certain way to push through. But revolutionary fervor, all these spring chicken uprisings, or that we could imagine. There's a lot to be said. But thank you for Cherubino, because it does show a kind of social poking and installation of the adolescent put in uniform. Adolescence in uniform could be the topic for this section of our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Avital. I guess this is sort of following from Susan's question, because I didn't actually hear her saying, I don't like psychoanalysis. I think she was saying some discomfort about this kind of linking together of the individual and the collective, and you said, I don't like the individual, I don't like the collective either. But there's still this kind of problem with scale, I guess. And I just wondered if maybe, since you mentioned training and teaching, if we could think about a kind of mid-level scale around the institution, and how much is the topic of adolescence a kind of occupational hazard for us, since kind of being on the scene of a kind of premature exposure to knowledge, a kind of traumatic exposure to knowledge is sort of our job description. And also, I think something that we are, I think, kind of successfully able to recapture ourselves in our own way we make our livelihood. So how much do you think this kind of encounter with the sort of being shaken down or shaken is sort of part of a occupational calling?
Or hazard, because there's a double bind or a triple bind at this point. Hamacher once wrote that all learning, if learning is to happen, it has to be traumatic. There's an invasion, maybe a body invasion, maybe something has to strike you. And that isn't an innocent locution. We're also on the edges always of, if not our seats, then transferential turbulence. Can learning take place without transferential madness or delight, if it can be limited in that way? I've thought about edipedagogy and what kind of Oedipal structures recur in learning, and what kind of regressions are necessary to unlearn, if that's part of learning as well, and what kind of traumatic seizings or seizures are implied in the scene of teaching and learning, and what to do with the student body. So certainly nowadays one is to skim off some of the more charismatic temptations to teach. It's very, very questionable whether the humanities are, certainly the humanities, where part of our teaching skills and passions open up in a theatrical way very often, whether that is still something that should be pursued or has to be cut back or cut down or cut out altogether. This is something that I'm contemplating very vigorously right now. What it is to be teaching at a time when the disavowal of transference is so strong and misapprehended. So I think these are very real questions and very urgent ones that I would like to continue to think about. And you're right that in a certain way, I suppose that the scene of pedagogy and teaching, the scenes to be remarkable, do they call up adolescent vulnerabilities and destructions? Do they rely on Nachträglichkeit and trying to find out what will have been taught or been reserved or not taught? What is the promissory note that one makes when engaging a teaching experience? And especially, I mean, this is an off-ramp, and I'm sorry for the fragmentary aspect of it. I've been puzzled recently that the president, the not our president, is so invested in his IQ and considers himself very smart. That keeps on recurring. And even to be a genius, but a balanced genius, by the way. I've never met a balanced genius. And even had a Trump University going on. So there's an investment and a disavowal, a disdain, a destruction of something like a doubling for the values that universities have built on. And it's a strange and phantomal doubling, and a really strange and insistent repetition compulsion about his IQ. You know, how smart he is. Why does he care if he's smart? If you're sovereign, you can be an idiot king, you know.
Tracy.
Thank you so much, Avital. I thought that was very moving. I've had several associations come to mind when you were talking, and two of them concerning immaturity and emancipation, and perhaps in particular emancipation. So I was thinking on the one hand about a certain Marxism, right, or even a certain theory of revolution, right, in which the people are not ready yet, right? So a vanguard is needed, a party is needed, right, a guide for people, right? So a certain understanding maybe of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? That implies the people need to be guided, but implicitly they never will be ready, right? Or sort of the the American system, popular will is inherently unstable, inherently immature in some way, and that's why we need institutions to contain and correct, right? And then on the other hand, and I think this is something that Lyotard takes up, although I can't recall in that piece you're referring to, a certain Christian ethics. It is time to put childish things aside, right? But also Paul saying, the law was our guardian until faith came. Guardian in the sense of babysitter, right? But now that we're all grown, we can put the law aside, right? And I think if I remember correctly that Lyotard really takes aim at this particular understanding of emancipation, right, as an emancipation sort of from the letter, right, from some sort of practice of the letter, right, as something that you need to continue to struggle with, to engage in some way, right, and it can't simply be sort of cast aside. So in some ways those two ideas seem almost diametrically opposed, right, that people are too immature, we're grown already, leave us alone, and yet neither one of them seems that satisfying, right? I think you really allowed us to understand that. But I wonder if you could talk about those examples, or what is an alternative way, right? I mean, what would it mean to make a place for adolescence, make a place for a certain immaturity, right? But to accompany it, to give it a place where it could be something other than just sort of a fatal or permanent immaturity.
Thank you. There's so much to be said, Tracy, in response to your intervention. If you read the correspondence, which I know you all have, of Marx and Engels, there's a moment where Marx says, holy shit, okay, that's my translation. Okay, we're moving forward, but what are we going to do with those Dummköpfe, these idiots, the proletariat? Are we really going to put it all on them to move forward with the authority of revolutionary accomplishment? Marx, since he was a teenager, was very worried about stupidity and how it would put a V-chip on or a damper on any kind of true growth out of a Kantian pessimism about our immaturity investments. This was a constant for one of his father's birthdays, birthday, Marx wrote a poem about how stupid the German folk was, and how he was very agitated about it in the poem, and that they would never be able to make a real revolution happen. So on the one hand, I think many revolutionary writers, thinkers, leaders are at once, as you point out, in the tyrannical way, banking on the immaturity and the successful appropriation of that trope that the people are too immature to be given the power they've just broken through to. So what happens will be the installation of a terrible dictatorship or authoritarian rule. You're absolutely right that is the disdain for the demos since Plato and before and after is always part of democracy, and it's always very often, as you say, couched in the diction of immaturity, that they're not ready yet, they're not ripe. And so tropologically that has to be contested, and with a number of things. When are you right? Maybe not being ready is the ready, and the readiness is all. Maybe being ready, unready is that tensional structure and quality that has to be invoked rather than, of course, a very exploitative and transparent decision that the other is not ripe for emancipation. At the same time, one wants to interrogate the thought that there is a historical development in the so-called individual, that one will ever become mature, ever since, since everyone, that one is held hostage to one's own immature regressions, that there are certain giddy, happy, joyous backslides that one even maybe only unconsciously sets up to get you in trouble or to get you to have real fun with existence and its limits and so on and so forth. So it's not clear, as Malraux and Lyotard insist, that we ever achieve adulthood. That's a mystification. That's when would one be able to claim one's credible maturity is one of the philosophical questions that Lyotard, reading Kant, and therefore opening a political arena. It's very scary to have all these immature, excitable teens running the show. But what would maturity look like? And it shouldn't, on the other hand, rigidify or scare the hell out of us the way certain kinds of inflexible determinations come across. Now, in the same text, as you point out, Lyotard says that what we learn is that emancipation itself, reading Abraham, reading Moses, and the handing down of the laws, emancipation itself is a terrible stumbling block and error. To think that you'll ever be free, which is not to say that you mustn't absolutely protest, decry, abominate injustice, racism, but to think in terms of, and this was something that was insinuated yesterday, if not said very clearly, some sort of reparative justice that comes along to make you free, even though that might be the necessary call that you take, understanding that you'll always be in shortfall. But Lyotard worries very much that we're utterly mystified by the false promise of emancipation. This is not an un-Freudian and necessary and brilliant lesson, perhaps, which is to say it in shorthand, or in Kafka, in his letter to the father, is how do you live with your unfreedom without doing harm to others or yourself? How do you live, Freudian vocab, as you will recognize, with your castration? And stop unwishing it. Stop thinking that there's another way except for your powerlessness. Someone like those all over the world who are becoming more and more authoritarian and unbearably so, don't live in their powerlessness, though they manifest their powerlessness and their little hands or little Hans issues, you know. So one of Lyotard's instigations or prods might be, how do you live with your extreme powerlessness and Hilflosigkeit, which is what Freud started that was the startup engine for Freud, one's essential helplessness. And the disavowal of one's helplessness creates devastating scenes of helplessness at all borders. So I think in that regard, Lyotard, you're so right, Tracy, to remind us that this is what Lyotard urges. It's impossible, but as I said, quoting my teacher, Derrida, if it weren't impossible, we wouldn't be handling it, you know? And it's only the impossible that we should welcome and try to live with and be taught by. So as it doesn't mean that you don't need emancipatory language, you don't need the poetry that frees you up and teaches you new addresses and new names for things, but to actually believe in the very immature thought of emancipation just keeps on getting us into trouble. It's foolish, it's infinitizing, and doesn't let you live with your chains and your wounds and your finite being, I would say. Thank you for that prod and smackdown.
We have time for one very short question and one very short answer.
Wait, was that a criticism?
We have two hands.
Hans, little Hans.
I think you had yourself earlier.
Sure. I have a very short question, which is, what would it mean to avow immaturity?
What was the other question? No, okay. No, thank you. What would it mean to avow immaturity? That's a very, that would be, I would think, he messed me up because he's saying, make it short. I'll make it short. I'm avowing immaturity. It would be a assume, accept the unflattering growth chart of humanity and its capacity for destruction, that it hasn't understood very much, to lean into the sheer ugliness, the fugliness, as Nietzsche would say, that's how I cover. You note that? You made me so nervous with the abbreviation. So that to not flatter ourselves that we've achieved very much, and our foolish institutions and righteous sense of things should maybe be consistently, and I'm sorry for the Yiddish syntax, it should be consistently subjected to rigorous hesitation. Like, really, is this what you're doing, what you're able to do? And, you know, there's been not enough hesitation, perhaps. So it would be very mature to get a close-up of our immaturity without condemning, without, as they say, judging, but I judge. But then seeing what to do about that without presuming to or wanting to in any way snuff it out. Don't forget that immaturity is the pump of creativity, poeticity, play. So there's a lot of room for it, and I do want to save that wildlife reserve that I've put myself in of extreme immaturity and play with language, with others, and stop some of the, you know, it might be that gravity and seriousness is sometimes very immature, and if you take a dialectical swing at it. Okay, I'm shutting up. Thank you.